So the first question that had popped up was basically, what do I think the intersections might be between the big five and attachment styles? So the first thing we would want to ask is, what are the big five? So the big five personality traits is a suggested grouping for personality traits developed in the late 1980s and onwards in psychological trait theory. And so when factor analysis, which is a statistical technique, is applied to certain personality survey data, it tends to reveal certain semantic or word associations. So some words are used to describe aspects of personality, and they are more often applied to the same type of person. So for example, someone described as conscientious is more likely to also be described as always prepared. So starting in the 1990s, the theory identified these five factors using labels for US English-speaking population. They are the following: openness to experience, and this is measured on a spectrum of inventive and curious versus consistent and cautious. Then we have conscientiousness, which is on a spectrum of efficient and organized versus extravagant and careless. Then we have agreeableness, which is on a spectrum of friendly and compassionate versus critical and rational. And then we have neuroticism, which is measured on a spectrum of sensitive and nervous versus resilient and confident. Now, beneath each of these kind of global factors, there are a number of correlated and more specific factors. So for example, extraversion is typically associated with qualities such as gregariousness, assertiveness, excitement seeking, warmth, activity, positive emotions, and so on. Now, of course, these things are not black and white, but they are placed more on a continuum. What does all of this have to do with attachment styles? Well, attachment styles, they are basically a blueprint for how you respond to threats to your important human relationships. And so in adulthood, this just most obviously expresses itself in intimate romantic relationships, which is why I choose to talk about them in this way. It's evidence of how your nervous system and your limbic brain reacts when an intimate partner feels either too close or too far away from you, because on an instinctual level, human beings believe that we need human connection in order to survive. And there's a certain quality of that connection that we need. So, are you someone who fights for a relationship, or are you someone who flies away until it is safe to come back? Or are you someone who freezes in the face of threat and doesn't know what they want or the best way to get it? Now, each of these would denote a particular way or style of attaching. Generally speaking, I view personality traits as essentially filters for attachment impulses. But two people who have different attachment styles could express the same personality trait and still be perceived as acting quite differently. And this is probably what gets really confusing for a lot of people. So, for example, a sports car and a trailer truck, they could both be painted green, but a sports car is likely to have more in common with another sports car than it does with a trailer truck. But if you're only looking at color, then you're going to inaccurately assume that it has more in common with a truck. So in my work, the best way I think to explain and describe these things is by looking at 5 archetypes for understanding emotional boundaries. And I talk a lot about these things in terms of emotional boundaries because emotions are energy moving through your body, and it is the quality of your energetic experience that determines the quality of your life in general. So personality traits are like doors inside of us that we open and that we close in order to channel and direct and interpret that energy in such a way that it feels like it is in service to us. And we do this with such frequency and repetition that it can come to define us archetypally. So in other words, in a universally patterned and predictable way. I think movie characters are really the best and most obvious way to think about this. So in an ensemble cast, there's likely to be some predictable character types. A smart one, a funny one, a shy one, an outgoing one, an aggressive one, a meek one, a rebel, a conformist, a villain, a hero, that kind of thing. But somebody can be smart and anxious or avoidant. Somebody can be funny and anxious or avoidant. Anxious folks can choose to conform or rebel just as much as an avoidant person can. So I have created a few archetypes on my own based on my own anecdotal experience and more than 15 years of working with adults struggling with these things to help people understand the ways in which attachment styles can express themselves through some of the same personality traits, even though it seems as if they're acting differently. I believe it's really important to understand this because when we find ourselves attracted to someone that appears to be our exact opposite, it's really important to realize how it's likely that they are operating in the same way that you are on an equal and opposite side of a coin on a fundamental level. And once you recognize that point of connection, attraction, or the intersections between you, now you actually start to deconstruct what I believe to be the spiritual lesson learned here. So this allows you to have more free will and choice around whether you wish to continue being in a relationship with that person or not. Does it serve my evolution or not? So to date, I've constructed 5 archetypes. Although this may evolve in the future. Today I'm going to share with you 2 detailed descriptions of the 2 archetypes that I think pop up the most frequently in my community, but the others do as well. And the remaining 3 that we're not going to get to, just because it's just beyond the scope of our discussion here, is the rescuer, the dictator, and the mediator. What we are going to talk about here today are the assimilators and the guards. So the first archetype I want to talk about here are assimilators. So do you lose your voice in a conflict and struggle to know what you truly need and desire in the context of a relationship? What does that mean? As an assimilator, it's likely that you have a lot of gifts to offer a partner and your loved ones. You've likely been described as helpful, sympathetic, willing to listen, caregiving, selfless, and supportive. It's so nice to be needed if you're an assimilator because you rarely take sides and you can see the world from multiple perspectives. Your role in social groups hovers between biggest fan and unofficial therapist, and that is a role that makes you proud, but it can exact a heavy toll. So your boundaries tend to be kind of fuzzy and loose. They're based on the expectations and the needs of those around you. Although this appears to be a form of empathy, it often feels and functions more like enmeshment. And so assimilators tend to melt into the demands and the needs of other people. Telltale behaviors include claiming to like things that you don't or that you don't know that you like in order just to get along. You may try to minimize your differences with others because you don't want to rock the boat. You could be the ultimate chameleon and kind of flawlessly conform to your social surroundings. So in a nutshell, assimilators are card-carrying people pleasers. But how would an assimilator handle anxiety or avoidance? So assimilators are often associated with anxious open hearts because of how people-pleasing they try to be. But the truth is, assimilators express themselves through dismissive avoidance, what I call a rolling stone, or disorganized attachment, what I call spice of lifers as well, especially when it comes to avoiding conflict. Anxious, open-hearted assimilators, they desperately need to be needed. They might dress the same way as their partner, take on their politics, and try to blend in with their life. They want to become essential to their partner so they cannot be discarded. They will swallow their needs and their desires for fear that it could cause a conflict and threaten the relationship. They tend to be motivated by a desire to be loved through sameness and or by fulfilling your lover's fantasy of an ideal partner. Now, an avoidant rolling stone assimilator, these folks are driven by the desire to blend in for the sake of popularity, positive regard, the respect of their superiors, and material gain. So they find freedom in anonymity and blending in, which is paradoxical because they then become a slave to the perceptions of others. So social approval is their gateway to comfort. So they often seek out orderly corporate environments with lots of structure. Avoidant assimilators are very likely to choose a partner that fits into a carefully crafted persona and doesn't provide too much emotional depth or challenge in the relationship. Avoidant assimilators are more concerned with being respected than being needed or supported, but they will bend over backwards to people please a partner and everyone around them in order to maintain an image. Now, the anxious part of a spice of lifer may want to blend in or be liked and accepted, and accomplish a sense of belonging in the way that the open heart does. And like a rolling stone, they too may want to avoid conflict to gain social approval for the respect that it garners, along with material benefits as well. However, their underlying motivations are usually more profoundly about survival, power, and dominance. So it's more than just wanting to be liked through sameness. It's a fear that they will be harmed, disenfranchised, or even killed physically, mentally, and or emotionally if they don't blend in. So it's more than just wanting money and respect because then people will like you. It's about having the power and resources available to protect and defend oneself, and offensively and even offensively when they finally come after you or scapegoat you. So the underlying theme for most anything a spice of lifer does is an unconscious belief or expectation that we live in a world where you either kill or be killed. So how does the assimilator struggle? Well, usually they struggle with identity confusion. So while assimilators tend to be chameleons and therefore they are tremendous survivors, they also tend to struggle with identity confusion. So do you actually like the things that you seem to prefer, or do you just prefer them because your partner or your social circle does? So in this case, I'd have you think of like Julia Roberts in Runaway Bride. So her character Molly is really a quintessential assimilator. So she would change her tastes and hobbies based on whomever she was dating, right down to the type of eggs that she liked to eat. Now, in the end, this caused a lot of heartache for her because she knew she wasn't the person that her jilted grooms thought they were marrying, but she also didn't know who she really was either. And so, there are some other examples of this, like darker, more extreme examples could be like characters from the Stepford Wives or even American Psycho, or another movie like Revolutionary Road. So in each of these storylines, we see characters kind of contorting themselves to fit a particular outward persona. In a few of those movies, it's very exaggerated. But they're also suffering tremendous inner conflict because of a loss of self-identity. And in some cases, that kind of anxiety that it generates can be acted out violently. So what is the deepest desire? For the assimilator, it is to be loved just as they are. So at their core, assimilators truly want to be loved for who they are. The desire to conform to a lover's preferences can be the result of a perceived lack of love in childhood. And so as a result, assimilators often equate deep love with being seen and understood, which unfortunately is not always the same thing as being respected and accepted. So they can wind up with partners who see and understand them, but don't necessarily respect and accept them. So the biggest growth challenge here is self-advocacy. So as an assimilator, your greatest challenge is to develop a deeper sense of self-identity. So you have to learn to advocate for yourself, to develop and cultivate the things that make you you. And in relationships, you've been taught to abandon yourself to relate to others. So the deeper work here is to become aware of when that is happening on an emotional level and consciously choose yourself instead. And so this is where we, it really gives truth to the old adage, finding love through learning to love yourself first. Now, how do you grow? You grow through self-respect. Self-advocacy paves the way for self-respect. But sometimes that can feel like a huge jump for an assimilator who has likely been largely dismissed or criticized or completely unacknowledged. And so self-respect is kind of a weighty process that begins with self-allowance. Then that leads to self-acceptance, which leads to self-appreciation, and then finally we arrive at self-respect. So this means that not only do you allow for yourself, but you accept yourself and you appreciate yourself, but you also find yourself worthy of regard and respect, and you refuse to let others treat you poorly anymore. So in essence, this is the establishment of vital boundaries. Each step along the way, it can take some time to really explore and embrace, but that is definitely a journey worth taking. But the second one I want to talk about is guards. Do you give away what you truly desire to receive? And then when someone tries to give it to you, it's like really hard to let it in. If so, then you might connect with the guard archetype. Guards are incredibly capable, helpful, amiable. They can be charismatic, caring, and service-oriented individuals. They are capable of reading a room, and they tend to get the lay of the land before they take too much action. On the other hand, guards can also have an inability to ask for help. They can struggle to recognize their own needs, and they typically don't let others in. When they are in need, they have a tendency to withdraw from others or give away exactly what it is that they want to somebody else. So at the heart of this struggle, guards confuse boundaries with walls, and walls are either up or they are down. And so a sense of intimacy and contact requires being either all in or all out. And if you are a guard, it's likely you've decided that all out is really the safest place to be. But that doesn't mean that they're not sympathetic or giving. In fact, they could be over-giving and even over-people-pleasing with everything except true emotional availability as a way of making contact. So a guard might say, when someone needs something from me, I can't say no, but when I need something, I don't feel like I can ask for it. But this insulation around their emotional life turns their inner world into a closed system. So it's like trying to breathe in a car parked in the sun with no air conditioning and no open windows. So eventually your life force energy is going to begin to suffocate. And sometimes the guard will compensate by opening a window just long enough to let some of the hot air out, but then they quickly close it again before any new air can get in. So for example, a guard could be inspired to attend a spiritual retreat or like a group therapy session because of a recurring painful pattern in relationships, but once they have let some of that air out, they experience momentary symptom relief. Then they go back to their old patterns until it becomes intolerable again. So they are always on guard about letting anything in. So how do guards express anxiety and avoidance? So anxious open hearts that identify with the guard style of communicating, they tend to externally offer connection while internally withholding it. So for example, let's say an open-hearted guard had a hard day at work or their pet died. When asked if they need support, they might downplay their pain and they say, you know, it's hard, but that's life. I'll get over it in time. It's probably not nearly as tough as what you are going through. Tell me how I can help you fix your problems. How can I be there for you? Now, guards that are rolling stones or more avoidant, they assume that when other people are in need, they want to be left alone, because that's what they would want. So for example, let's say a rolling stone had a hard day at work and found out that their pet died. A rolling stone might say, you know, I wish everybody would leave me alone. This is life. There's no need to fuss about it. If they're trying to control or console somebody else, they might say, oh, I'm sorry you feel that way. I bet you need time. I'll leave you alone. Now, a spice of lifer could respond in either one of these two ways. But usually, if they have a lot of momentum tied up in their attachment style, their motivations will be different. So the open heart deflects because they don't want to appear a burden or to risk getting upset or upsetting someone else with their problems. Whereas the spice of lifer could experience some of that, but underneath it there will be a fear that they are most vulnerable when they're grieving. And therefore they are exposed in a way that could lead to someone taking malicious advantage of it. Now the rolling stone might leave you alone because that's what they would want to process their feelings. But the spice of lifer steers clear because they're afraid your pain is a trap that is set to suck them into your drama. And somehow, inevitably, you're going to make them responsible for both causing and fixing it. So the guard struggles with an inability to receive, an inability to ask for help, struggling to recognize your own needs, and typically not being able to let others in. And so when a guard is in need, they have a tendency to give away that which they most require, or to find a way to limp along without it. And why would they do this? Well, because they believe love is scarce, and everything is a weighted scale, and to get you have to give. In fact, sometimes you have to give more than you get just to get anything at all. But the problem with getting is that guards also don't know how to receive, because receiving means you might become dependent on something that can be taken away. So don't give me a full meal only to tell me that I will never eat again. And guards believe that the food is always going to be taken away, so they get used to living off rations. They prefer it that way. But part of finding the love that you want is letting go of beliefs that don't let love in. So you can't go around saying, I want this and this and that in love and relationships, and then you refuse to accept it when it shows up because of a story of unworthiness or a fear of liking it too much that you'll crumble if you should ever lose whatever it is. And so that sends a very confused and contradictory message to the universe. So when you want something, and there's no doubt, that's very clear. But when you want something and then you contradict that desire with doubt, and by giving it away to your detriment because you're afraid of someone seeing how badly you really need it, that is what we call resistance or defensiveness. And that is always going to work against you. And so what is the deepest desire? Well, the guard's deepest desire is actually to be rescued, because a guard cannot let their guard down and wouldn't know how to do that even if they wanted to usually. So they desperately want a partner who's going to knock down those walls for them or climb up the high tower and rescue them. So they tend to be attracted to folks that are very effusive and struggle with boundaries, that are too transparent or too loose or too aggressive or non-existent. In other words, folks that will either ignore a question or rail against the guard's very opaque and rigid walls. So as a result, guards are likely to be attracted to the other subtypes because the other types have far looser boundaries than a guard. And those are the dictators, the assimilators, or the rescuers. Because these other types of partners express aspects of themselves that the guard tends to deny or suppress. And the guard considers these partners very arousing and challenging. These are partners that they will love to hate and hate to love. So guards tell themselves that their cool, calm collectedness and or their capacity for selflessness and problem solving makes them a perfect match for their more excitable or effusive lovers. But the truth is that their lover rescues the guard from being entirely sapped of their life force energy. They are being saved or rescued by their partner from spiritual aridity, because our needs and emotions are the mouthpiece of our soul's thirst for a sense of purposefulness. And without an effusive lover, it is hard for the guard to tap into that for themselves. Now, less common, but also possible, you could find a guard that only feels safe with another guard. And this type of guard usually has a history of trauma or severe maltreatment in their past, and they've decided that settling for safety is preferable over the high of being challenged. And by extension, you could find a guard like this marrying another guard, but then having extramarital affairs with a dictator, a assimilator, or a rescuer. Now, the biggest growth challenge for a guard is to trust yourself. When you desire for someone to rescue you, it's because you don't believe you're capable of rescuing yourself, which means you harbor deep-seated distrust of your own capacities, capabilities, and resiliency. Add to that, there may also be an underlying sense of resentment and anger about having to take care of yourself prematurely. And so your inner child will be damned before allowing you to take responsibility for something that someone else should have done in the beginning, in your childhood, even if this means avoiding taking responsibility for feeling your own feelings and improving the quality of your relationships now. Now, I don't want you to mistake me. Guards are highly capable and often come across as extremely self-sufficient and independent, whether they are anxious, avoidant, or disorganized, sometimes to the point of anti-dependence. But this is often an overcompensation for feeling the exact opposite deep down. I only wish someone could take on this burden, but no one else will do it as well as I can. So this is a sentiment that reflects an early pressure to assume more responsibility than was your due, because you realize that was the only way to exert some control and personal agency in your situation. Okay, usually in early childhood. Then you were probably praised for being so mature, right? For being parentified, because it turned you into a well-behaved help rather than a misbehaving burden. And so the mask of self-sufficiency and not needing anything from anyone kind of gives you a sense of power. And so to relinquish the mask is very scary, and it leads to feelings of vulnerability and helplessness. And that's not exactly the most persuasive argument for being more emotionally available in relationships. But in clinging to this mask, we tend to keep ourselves apart from who we really are. And this only breeds more distrust and constant inner turmoil. And so the guard's growth challenge is really to learn to trust themselves well enough to allow for scary, helpless feelings that will ultimately open them up to a wide range of human emotion, which finally allows them to receive the love that they truly want and need. So how do they grow? Well, they grow through self-allowance. So guards are often preoccupied with the notion of self-improvement in order to accomplish their goals in life and relationships. But this preoccupation is misdirected because it interferes with a process of self-allowance, which is what a guard truly needs to practice if they are to meet this growth challenge. So self-improvement suggests two things, which can work in the external world, but it really wreaks havoc on your internal world. So number one, you're not okay just as you are. And number two, there's an achievable end goal of a most perfect self, right? And in the world of attachment theory, a most secure self. So this is the same premise that underlies all conditional forms of love. I cannot love you unless you contort yourself to meet my terms of endearment. If you really loved me, you wouldn't do that. I cannot be happy unless you behave the way I want you to. It also suggests you cannot find love unless you have healed enough to deserve it. But self-allowance honors the truth that the self is never really fully integrated into a static concept of identity. I would have you believe instead that it is a fluid process of activated and deactivating parts that are constantly moving in and out of your consciousness, and our feelings are telling us which ones to pay attention to when. So just remember, as a guard, you are capable, you are strong, you are resilient, and you have so much love to offer, and it is time to let that love in.